All right, good afternoon. Thank you so much for your patience as we got started here a little bit late today. But we will go ahead and call this Student Achievement Committee meeting to order at 1:36. So here in attendance today, we have committee members Christine Kushner and Karen Carter. Ms. Johnson-Hassler, I believe, will be joining us virtually in a little bit. Ms. Cash is unable to attend, and we do have Dr. Martin here in person as well as Dr. Gardner and Attorney Blumberg. So thank you to everyone for your attendance today. We do have just one topic for today that we'll be talking about in just a few minutes. But first, before we move forward, if I could please entertain a motion to approve the minutes from March 28th.
Motion to approve the minutes from March.
Thank you. We've got a motion from Ms. Kushner and a second from Ms. Carter. Is there any discussion about the minutes? All right. All those in favor, please show a sign of aye. Any opposed, same sign. And the motion passes, so those minutes are approved. So as we continue along, this is an annual update that we receive, and very thankful for this information as it shapes a lot of the work that we do in many other ways. So we have today our comprehensive plan for equitable discipline, and we have Mr. Paul Coe and Dr. Catherine Chantos here in person, and they will be presenting. So I will just turn it over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ms. Scott, and good afternoon, Committee Chair Scott, Dr. Gardner, and board members. We bring to you today a high-level overview of our comprehensive plan for equitable discipline, which will be the first presentation in the two-part presentation. And part two of this presentation will be brought to you at our May 23rd Student Achievement Committee meeting. And I'm joined today by Kathy Chantos, a long-respected member of our district who's been consulting with us to support our work. And so our desired outcomes for today's presentations are that we want to revisit our context with the Office of Civil Rights and the implications of where we stand with OCR. And then we want to connect our work to our core beliefs. We also want to provide an overview of the updated document for our comprehensive plan for equitable discipline. And I might say CPED in short sometimes, so that I'm trying to shave some time. And also, we want to provide you time as a board to connect with the updated document as well. And we'll also provide some examples of the elements within our CPED plan. And then we'll share with you the next steps in the process of us monitoring our work as a district through our CPED. So I will first now pass it to Kathy Chantos, who will provide us with an overview of the context for our CPED.
Good afternoon. Thank you for allowing me to come and talk to you about this. As you know, we've been working on the Comprehensive Plan for Equitable Discipline since 2014. We put this plan into place, and we've been monitoring and reporting on it ever since. In August of 2020, we completed our final report for the 3-year monitoring period that began 2017 to 2018. At this time, we haven't received any official confirmation from OCR that they are releasing us now from the monitoring, but we anticipate that. We just don't have that yet. So we have moved from the Comprehensive Plan for Equitable Discipline as we knew it, which was a large, comprehensive, unwieldy document, really, into a more streamlined skeleton document that we're sharing with you today. This document will allow us to monitor our progress on a quarterly, semester, and annual basis and report out accordingly. The action steps from the Comprehensive Plan for Equitable Discipline that we have used all those years are the same. They have all been rolled over into this document. They are ongoing. They are all linked to the guiding principles from the original document. A major change that you will note when Paul starts going over it with you is that we kept the guiding principles in view. They're on the document, so we don't lose those because we continue to believe they are very important. But we have moved to organizing it by beliefs. from the strategic plan. And Kathy Moore was the one that really suggested that, because that kind of gives it power within the system, that we're organizing it as the system organizes their work. So Paul will talk to you more about that. But in this presentation, we'll familiarize you with all of the changes and the important updates that we made to the document. But I want you to feel confident that we haven't lost any of the important core responsibilities that we had during both the reporting and the monitoring period with OCR. And this has also been reviewed by Tharrington Smith. Neil Ramey went over it with a fine-tooth comb and feels like we have created something that will continue to best represent the efforts of the district.
Thank you, Kathy, for that overview. And so to continue our presentation, we want to frame the work of our comprehensive plan for equitable discipline through our core beliefs 1, 2, and 5. And through the comprehensive plan for equitable discipline and our agreement with the Office of Civil Rights, though it required us to be compliant and monitoring the progress of our district, and in the previous version, we used our guiding principles that we developed in climate and prevention, clear, appropriate, and consistent expectations and consequences, and equity and continuous improvement. We felt it was important to move beyond the older document itself and connect this work to the aspirations that we articulate in our core beliefs, as Kathy mentioned. And so we just wanted to remind you of the core beliefs one more time, where through our core belief number 1, we want to use the CPED as a tool to support the work in our schools, ensuring every student is uniquely capable and deserves to be challenged and engaged in relevant, rigorous, and meaningful learning each day. And through core belief number 2, we want to use the CPED as a tool to support the work in schools, ensuring every student is expected to learn, grow, and succeed, while we eliminate the ability to predict achievement based on socioeconomic status, race, and ethnicity. And through core belief number 5, we want to use the CPED as a tool to ensure that we support the work as a district to amplify our desire to become a diverse school community that is inviting, respectful, inclusive, flexible, and supportive. And so the core beliefs are how we might articulate our why as a district for continuing the use of the CPED as a living progress monitoring tool. And so along with our core beliefs, as we continue our transition from response to recovery, I know you've seen this slide several times before, from this pandemic, our work through our CPED is part of our larger multi-year transition as a district to continue to find the balance between our focus on pandemic response and our core work in delivering high-quality instruction and meeting the behavioral health needs of our students and staff. And much of today's presentation is about how we are reimagining, redefining, and reinventing our work as we continue our transition from response to recovery through the lens of the CPED. And so before we continue in our presentation, we wanted to provide you with a focused reading protocol as a lens to review our updated CPED. And, as you may know, focused reading is a protocol for processing, exploring, and discovering a piece of text, and is visible in many of our WCPSS classrooms. And so you'll see the latest draft of our CPED in Simbly. And we wanted to give you a few minutes to silently read and annotate the updated document on your own. And something we wanted to suggest through this protocol is you can use a check mark to note where there are elements aligned to your knowledge, practices, or beliefs. You can use an exclamation point to note connections to our district's vision, mission, and beliefs and priorities. And you can use a question mark beside elements where you want to learn more about them. And once we've given you that time, we will come back to our protocol towards the end of our presentation and ask you to share your thoughts as part of our discussion. So given that, just to try to model good teaching, we want to give you maybe 5 minutes to review the document, and once you all review it and make your notes, we can move on to the next slide. Just wanted to let y'all know there's a little less than a minute left according to my timer, but if y'all are ready to begin, just please let us know.
I think we're good. Thank you.
So thank you for taking the time to begin our engagement in the overview of our updated document. And I think as we said before, one thing I wanted to reiterate is that in our transition from the old version of the CPED to the new, it's really us trying to proactively move from just a compliance act that we were up to in the CPED, where we would bring this to you just annually, but use this more as a proactive maybe culture shift so that we can more regularly use this as a tool, as we said, as a living progress monitoring tool that we can use as a framework to bring you updates, not just about discipline like we've done in the past, but of all the components related to this updated CPED document. So thank you for, again, just going through that. And towards the end of the presentation, we'll have time for you all to share your thoughts about the updated document. And so I first wanted to begin with an overview of how the document for our CPED has been redesigned. And I think on your slides, it should be slide, if you go to slide 6, I believe. We wanted to share with you that, this is the good work that Kathy was talking about. Kathy has been working with our superintendent, our attorneys, and WCPSS team members to make specific changes to the document so that there's more explicit alignment to our core beliefs 1, 2, and 5, as I noted earlier. And secondly, that there are specific actions connected to both academic achievement and behavioral health, because we felt it's important that instead of just looking at one side of the indicators, that our approach as an academic advancement division, as a district, is we're trying to make sure that we're paying attention to both as we move forward in this process. And then third, we have organized data, our tools, practices to be organized by the sections within academic achievement and behavioral health as well. So we just wanted to let you know that there's a larger framework based on the core beliefs, but we also wanted to let you know that our older guiding principles that we used for the older version of the CPED are still aligned to this document as well. And so at this point, we wanted to share with you some examples of our work as a district, what that will look like within academic achievement. And so the action steps note our expectations in the coming slides, and I will share more about the data, tools, and practices used to measure and implement our action steps. And so in this slide, you'll see that under core belief 1, one example that we wanted to bring to you is that we want to set high expectations for achievement and behavior for all students. And this is tied to the second guiding principle from our older CPED document under clear, appropriate, and consistent expectations and consequences. And then under core belief 2, one example that we want to highlight is for us to use evidence-based instruction that supports effective student engagement and classroom management. And this is tied to the first guiding principle from our older comprehensive plan for equitable discipline under climate and prevention. And then under core belief 5, another example that we wanted to share with you is our responsibility to train school staff to apply school discipline policies and practices in a fair and equitable manner to not disproportionately impact at-risk minority or students with disabilities. And this is tied to our third guiding principle from our older CPED document under equity and continuous improvement. And then in the next slide, similar to our academic achievement action steps, we have behavioral health action steps organized under our core beliefs. And you'll see that under core belief 1, one example we wanted to lift up is that we want to ensure any alternative settings provide students with academic instruction and return students to their regular class as soon as possible. And this is tied to the second guiding principle from our older CPED document under the clear, appropriate, and consistent expectations and consequences. And under core belief 2, one example for our action step is to promote social emotional learning to complement academic skills and encourage positive behavior. And this is tied to our first guiding principle from our older CPED document under climate and prevention. And under core belief 5 for behavioral health, another example we want to lift to you is to provide regular training and supports to all school personnel, including teachers, principals, support staff, and SROs on how to engage students and support positive behaviors. And this is tied to the guiding principle of climate and prevention from our older CPED document. And so with our action steps, setting our expectations in the academic achievement and behavioral health components of our work, we want to share some of the key formative and summative data we plan to use to monitor our work through the CPED. And so in all of our data, we just wanted to note that we will review our data for disproportionality by race, our students' IEP 504 status, socioeconomic status, English learner status across all levels and regions. And so some of the examples of our formative data that we are going to review are attendance data that would be pulled monthly, quarterly, and of course, when we get to the summative on an annual basis. Our behavioral health needs assessment, which measures behavioral health indicators we've reviewed with you before at our schools by semester. And then our school improvement indicators tie this work with our school improvement plans on a regular basis that we'll be working with our schools. And then we'll also be reviewing our teacher work conditions survey that we use the data that comes on every even numbered year. And then we would also be looking at WCPSS student survey data, which is an annual survey of student engagement that we would also review. And then our ECATS behavior incidents, we would also review the behavior incidents on a quarterly, semester, and annual basis, both at the major incident and minor incident levels. And then also with office discipline referrals, we would review these referrals also quarterly, by semester, and annually. And examples of our summative data that we would review are our graduation rate, both by cohort, but we would also review within that data our dropout rates as part of this review. We'd also look at end of course and end of grade assessments by semester and annually. We would look at course grades, review course grades annually. We would look at course failure rates annually. And then, of course, we've brought to you often the discipline data paired with the CPED, but I think our shift in this work now is to have the discipline data just be a part of the CPED work, but that would be data that we would also review on an annual basis for both suspensions and behavior incident data. And then lastly is on the list is attendance, as we would review that as part of our CPED process. And then along with our review of formative and summative data, it's important for us to continue monitoring the impact of our tools and practices through our CPED. And our tools and practices are centered through the lens of our multi-tiered system of supports within academic not academic advancement, but academic achievement and behavioral health elements of our CPED. And some of the examples of the tools and practices that we plan to monitor, this one specifically around building staff capacity, are around staff professional learning, our professional learning teams, our efforts with restorative practices and training staff, our community resilience model, our MTSS coaches and their work with staff, our tiered behavior resource guide. And some of the examples of the tools and practices that we will monitor that support our students are group counseling, community liaisons, our student support services teams at schools, again, our restorative practices and their impacts on students, our community resilience model and its impact on students, our alternative learning centers, and our alternative education schools and programs. And so as part of the close to this presentation, we did want to bring you back to the protocol we asked you to engage in earlier in the presentation. And I'll pause here now before our final slides to see if you want to provide some thoughts around any elements from the CPED that align to your knowledge, practices, or beliefs, any connections to our district's vision, mission, and beliefs, and any parts of the CPED you'd like to learn more about. And then I can get to the final slide, and then maybe from there we can answer any questions at the end of the presentation.
Thank you so much, Mr. Coe. And I'm sure my colleagues have a little bit of feedback, comments. Ms. Carter, did you have any questions or comments you wanted to share?
I was trying to find, sorry, I've made some notes on the printout here. And I was wondering, and again, I might just be asking this question, but I saw under the action step belief 1 for academic achievement, for defined and standardized expectations for all students. A question I had about that was, is that what is considered in the handbook? Are you talking more specific for in each classroom, and how is that communicated to ensure that it is standardized, I guess is my thought on that. And I just wanted to clarify what that was referring to.
Yeah, thank you, Ms. Carter. I think that's a great question, and I think the way I might answer it is that I think it's that third point that you said. We're trying to make sure that we are both, we have standards on the academic side for all content, but I think it's sometimes we miss like what the behavioral aspect of academic learning can look like. So I think it's a holistic approach to making sure that are we expecting the same for all of our students and at the same standard that both the state and our district expects of what our students are learning. So I think it's all of that in a holistic process. And I think the thing that I would say is that the action steps are kind of more of a general statement, but when you get to the tools and practices, I would say the way that we would make sure that we're aligning the standardization of expectations for students is through our MTSS approach, both on the academic and behavioral side, so that we understand is everything that's supposed to be happening at the core level where it needs to be. And then when we think about supplemental and intensive supports that students would need at the interventions that come up, are those also standardized in the same way? So I think I would say that that's the lens that we would approach the expectations with, both on the academic and behavioral health side.
Okay. And I guess this is more like a general comment in overall. And because I was making some notes on this, and I kind of viewing this through a few different lenses, not only as a board member, but also as a parent that had students go through Wake County. And I'm just curious if folks are feeling like some of these, they have concerns that, where we would like to be headed is not really what's happening in their schools. What would be the one thing that you would recommend? Because I know I have had some firsthand experience with it, and I have heard from others that oftentimes, and I'm focusing like, inclusion and feeling like everyone is included, and around bullying and, how that can escalate, and then how that is, and I know I'm going off on kind of but just trying to look for, just because I've heard it so often, and just the best way, because I feel like it really varies. I've heard, and like I said, firsthand have seen just a wide variety of responses. And, I'm not,
No, I
just a
think-
lot. And it kind of can lead to different avenues, and then to take it a step further when we start suspending or I'm just going to go down that path too, or expulsions, and really ways, I'm going really far here, sorry. Really ways to ensure that we're keeping all students somehow connected to an education path and not completely closing that door. And ensuring, I know that's a couple different things all at once, but I just want to kind of throw it out there. I know there's some legality issues with the expulsion. I'm not trying to, I just really hope, because we're an education system, and that I want to ensure that we're keeping that path open, because these are students, and some of them can be quite young, and doors in some families' eyes feel closed, and once they start closing, it's hard to get that student back engaged. And then in my opinion, we are we're changing their path and what's open to them.
So I'd like to say something about that. One of the things that those of you who are familiar with this document from all the years of reporting on it, and as Ms. Kushner indicated, it primarily was linked to discipline, specifically reporting out suspensions. And we did an excellent job over many, many years of reducing suspensions. We were working to close disproportionality in that effort, and we did narrow it some, and we were able to reduce suspensions to representing just 4% of our student body. What was still missing gets to your point, though, Ms. Carter, that in reporting just discipline in the absence of also looking at academic achievement was very limiting, because the reason you want to reduce discipline, the reason you want to reduce suspensions specifically, is because when students are in school, they're learning. when we suspend them out of the classroom or the school, then they don't have the access to their academic achievement that we want them to have. So we broke this document up into academic achievement, academic advancement, and behavioral components so that we could sort of reflect that and make sure that our focus didn't get so laser focused on just the discipline aspect that we missed what we are doing it for. Why are we engaged in this work? Yes, it's to reduce disproportionality. That is very important. Why do we want to do that? Well, we want to do all of it so that all of our students will achieve in academics and then in their future and in life. So we are trying to get at that. The second thing that I would say, and your point is well taken, that there is a lot of variety out there. And in many ways, our action steps are aspirational, but they also have meat attached to them. So should a school have difficulty with meeting these goals and objectives outlined in the action steps, we would certainly have something that we could reference and talk to them about, as well as share the tools and practices that will better equip them to meet the action steps.
And Ms. Carter, something I might add to in terms of directly answering your first question, I know from there it went to many things, but from whenever our students need support, reaching out to a counselor is a great place to start from the student support services lens. And I think on the academic side, anytime there's a support, we encourage our students and families to connect with our educators and teachers as needed. And then also our principals are always available to connect with our students and families as needed. And I think to add on to what Kathy was saying, you just gave us a list of reasons why being proactive in this work is so important, and not just wait for OCR to give us whatever their assessment is. But our work in all of this was to kind of redesign what is this for? Like, despite the OCR process that we've been in since 2014, what's the way that moves us towards an aspirational place to kind of help shift our culture? And I would say this document is about kind of the balcony level of how we're doing as a district across several layers and systems that we are taking part in and engaging in to hopefully ensure that all students have access to a path in education and hopefully a successful life and career, right? But I think what we need to do is figure out from this, the living document of monitoring our district processes, what are the moves we need to make that are high leverage over time, so that each fixed moment of time, whether that's a year or a semester or whatnot, we are making actionable suggestions and resources and tools so that schools can actually engage in improvement, right? Because one of our key principles from the older document was equity and continuous improvement, and that's what this document is for. So I would also add that to Kathy's answer in response to your question.
And thank you for that question, Ms. Carter, and the comment. It was an excellent one, and what a great response. And I wish I could put that on a sign. I'm trying to paraphrase here, but we do this so our students can succeed in academics and in life. And I mean, when you bring it back to that statement, is the same thing as parenting. When as a parent of two tweens right now, why this, why that? And now that they're a little older, I can say that because this is something that will help prepare you. This is helping prepare. And what a great statement. And thank you for that question. Very powerful. I also wanted to thank Board Member Haggerty has joined us in person as well, so we can note that for attendance. Ms. Kushner.
Thank you, and thank you for the presentation, Mr. Coe and Ms. Shantos, because I think to Ms. Carter's point, we do all this because we want our students to be in school, and I think that we've learned that anything else in the pandemic, we've learned how central schools are to the lives of our children. And I love all the, I'm a big fan of the community responsive, the CREM program, and restorative practices, but I do wonder, and they're great, this is a great framework, but I put a big exclamation point next to staff capacity, because we have these great trainings, we have these great programs, and also to Ms. Carter's and Ms. Scott's points, how do we continue to build the staff capacity, be able to put these programs in place? Because it is, I think the pandemic upturned so many of us in our daily lives, and our children came back to school with a very different status of mental health. And so we all know that. We've heard that from our educators and folks in the schools. So what are we doing to really expand that capacity so that our teachers have the skills? Because, we've talked about it last night, time for training is sparse. And I can understand teachers and just not being able to remember all the things we tell them or their training. So how are we going to get to that?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Ms. Kushner. And I think I would say it's actually a little bit tied to the budget conversation that we were having last night around that. Now we're calling it the behavioral health supports.
Thank you for bringing it to that.
Yeah, expansion case.
I'm writing down that talking point.
Yeah, and I think the more that we have staffing ratios that get closer to what the nationally recommended ratios are, the more that we'll have availability of staff who can train us in that. But I think, remember, it's not just that group that's the key. Our teachers are incredibly important, as are our administrators and principals, right? But I think the more that we get to that, the more that we have people available. And I think central office-wise, if you look in our CAS department, we have instructional specialists who have been hired. If you remember, back when I first came on, our restorative practices program was a small team of 4 people that were funded by Kellogg to start the implementation of restorative practices at a few of our elementary schools. But now we've expanded that further, and I think what that looks like is probably a recent training that our team did over at Zebulon Elementary School, where in working with the principal, we went over both restorative practices and CRIM strategies with the entire staff, with this group of staff that have been a part of this funding over time that we've done, right? And so I would say that's one key need, right? But I know budget is always tough because we can only do as much as we can because we have all kinds of other needs in the district. But the more that we pay attention to the holistic needs of how we get there, I think is important. And I think secondly, making sure that we're increasing the capacity of the folks who are training our folks at the schools to provide. I think it goes from how are we designing professional learning when there are mandated trainings like letters. We can't just say, oh, there's letters and then do this also.
Right.
We have to be mindful of how we schedule it, and if we're aware of the amount of time that our educators have to take to get trained in letters, we have to kind of sometimes step back and let that happen and then bring in additional ways to train our staff and support them at another time so that we can not throw a million things at them at once, even though we do that unintentionally a lot of the time.
But sometimes you can't get to the letters strategies you need if you're not able to do, have your kids have some resilience and use restorative practices. So it's all a continuum, as you'd said.
Yeah, and I think it's a balancing act for us, but I think what this document helps us do is that to help folks remember academics and the behavioral health stuff is intertwined, and we need to work on that together and not as separate tracks.
And you're also reinforcing Mr. Cook's point about the need for time for our middle and high school staffs, perhaps, to be able to do some of this work. So thank you.
And I'll just add one more thing to that nothing promotes the training opportunities that you have more than the success of the people who have already taken the training. So to your point about CRIM and restorative practices, once you've had CRIM and restorative practices, you become a champion of those programs and a champion of that professional development, which also encourages other schools and teachers to take and use that. So it's the dollars involved in it, it's the time that it takes, but as we build trained schools and teachers, the momentum behind that, because of the success that they find using the programs, does help provide the advertisement that you need internally to continue putting it forth to other
Because there is some
schools.
cynicism, I think, out there about these programs.
Right.
Because they want consequences and accountability.
That's
and I'm
correct.
Like, this is how you're teaching kids to have self-accountability
And once you can
self-regulation.
once you can
That's
provide
magic.
an alternative
Yes.
view of that works, that doesn't just let the kid off the hook, as many teachers think.
Right.
You're not letting them off the hook. You're just channeling it in a more positive growth channel, rather than it being a punitive recidivism. You're pushing it forward so that the child continues to grow and learn, both behaviorally and academically.
Because I think it's parallel with student voice, student agency, and that self-regulation.
Correct. And teacher
So,
agency.
Yes.
And teacher
yes,
choice. You're adding to
absolutely.
to their tool bucket.
Yeah, thank you. And I'll
No, that's a great point. And I mean, I had a conversation with an assistant principal a few years ago who was talking about tracking the number of repeat office referrals for students who had participated in restorative conversations. And at that point in time, it was very raw, very early data, but it was zero repeat office referrals for students who had been able to process the what, why, and, and that's amazing. I mean, that's outstanding. That's great. I mean, that certainly sells that as well. Mr. Haggerty.
Thank you. I'm not sure which of you might have an answer on this, but even an estimate would be fine. I'm curious about the professional development costs for the different programs, either when you expanded or just kind of like what your ongoing annual maintenance would be. Do you have an estimate of what it would cost the district to go to like the next level in some of these programs that you've identified?
I think from a material standpoint, I would say, Mr. Haggerty, I'd have to get the exact figures, but I think it's more on the minimal side, but it's more in the people. So when we bring on our people, they go through, with Fidelity, their own training about, for example, with restorative practices, there's circle keeping at the core level, but there's also how to do conflict mediation circles that's more at the supplemental or intensive levels. But there's also, we have partnerships with Campbell Law, for example, to do the intensive, when there is a outright conflict that needs to be resolved with more experts. They are brought in through an MOU and a contract to the school to do that type of facilitated mediation. So I would say to build the capacity is to make sure that our trainers that they are continuing to learn and grow in the programs, and they attend, like, say, the annual trainings with related to the Trauma Resource Institute, who gives us materials and the frameworks for CRIM. And then same thing with restorative practices, continuing the work that we do with, we work sometimes with Kay Pranis, who, has championed restorative practices, across the country. But those are more minimal and for our teams. But I think for us, amplifying to your point, Mr. Haggerty, it's about time and concerted effort so that we're not trying to just rush people and make people feel like it's another mandate they must do or else. It's more about letting to Kathy's point, letting the word and impact of how the trainings went from the educator's lens, let that word spread, but also continue to provide the predictable times at which people can join these trainings at the beginning of the year, middle of the year, or even at the end of the years. So I think us growing that almost more like concentric circles over time is how I would answer that question. It's less of a finance issue, but more about time and effort, I believe.
Okay, let me reframe the question, if I may. So then, if there were allied organizations or concerned groups that wanted to support this type of work and assist the district, and financial resources were available, would those be something that would be welcome? Or if not, if we don't need them, if it's just something we can just do internally, please clarify. But if it is something where additional resources would be welcome, do you have an idea of what level of funding would make an impact?
I would have to talk to my team a little bit more about that, Mr. Haggerty. But of course, resources and help is always welcome. I'm not trying to sit here and say, oh yeah, starting tomorrow we're ready to go, and don't worry, all 190 plus schools will be trained with Fidelity. That's not where we're at. But I think we're trying to take the approach specifically around restorative practices. It's an invitational process, right? And so we don't ever say you must do this or else, but it's actually gotten as big as it has because people have bought into it who have been trained, but also we've seen impact related to it. Those Kellogg schools we presented a few years ago, they saw dramatic decreases in suspensions, right? And so there's evidence to back it up. But I think as long as if we are to partner with communities, as long as there is alignment and a will, I think we would take all the help that we can get. We would just have to have conversations with those folks.
Okay, I appreciate that. That's, when you'd mentioned the Kellogg support, that's sort of what I was thinking of. If there might be another partner similar to Kellogg that might be willing to invest in maybe an expansion or taking the next step. So thank you.
Dr. Martin?
Thank you for the presentation and the ongoing work. Sort of want to build on the discussion that we've been having. We're a long ways from where we started. Ms. Santos, I think, as you noted, we really have been shifting from a response to discipline to, why do we do this? We want to get, our goal is behavior change. Behavior change so that we engage and learn and build community. And what we're talking about is a real mindset shift, and that takes time. So I guess I'm not quite sure how to sort of frame my thoughts, looking through this. And I want to recognize the good work and also the long ways we have to go. I guess my first sort of question response is, how do we get the framework off the page? As an education practitioner in the classroom every day, I'll tell you, I get pretty frustrated with the education world that has tons of spreadsheets with lists of this, that, and the other thing. I personally have come to hate SMART goals. And the reason I do is because, when we have this overemphasis on the SMART goal, the measurable, we end up making simple goals instead of idea goals. And they become very spreadsheet-oriented, sort of checkbox-oriented. And to the teacher in the classroom, it's just like, okay, I can check this box, but, and so I, noting things like, we want removing from the classroom to be a last resort, right? As an idea, absolutely we agree. In practice, when I've got 30 kids in my classroom, one disruption can shut down learning for an entire day. How do we deal with that? I mean, it's so is it the last resort, or does that, right, the reality becomes a little more complex than the spreadsheet bullet? Because the reality may be that it ought to be the first resort to remove into a constructive setting so that I can come back, right? We talk about, returning to regular class as soon as possible. Again, at the 10,000-foot view, that's a really good goal. I'm not sure I want to return as soon as possible. I want to return as soon as effective from my classroom perspective. And so maybe there's not a good answer. In fact, there probably isn't an answer because systems change takes a long time. But how do we, and I think you sort of answered it by, right, as people do it and see it works, that's the best way to build framework, right? But, and so maybe it's more rhetorical question. How do we get from spreadsheet framework to lived context? How do we get so that a teacher doesn't just feel like I'm being told by the experts to do something, but come to my classroom and, there's a lot of experts who couldn't actually do what they're telling people to do. How do we take our framework? How do we take our ideas and get it lived out? And a little bit to Ms. Carter's point, because this gets at kind of our school-to-school variation, our classroom-to-classroom variation. But I can take that same framework and I can have the compliance principal, AP, or teacher who says, see, look, I fit the framework very, very well. And I can have another setting where it's really happening. The compliance isn't necessarily doing that behavior shift. So you hear my frustration a little bit? How do we get from the spreadsheet to the practice. And like I say, maybe rhetorical, it's practice.
I got one thing to say.
Yeah.
I'll be quiet. I feel like I keep jumping in.
No, but you should.
One reason that we shifted from straight listing of action steps and activities, Dr. Martin, was to get at some of that. That if a teacher, a principal, when they're looking to reach them, they see a bunch of things I have to do. These are my expectations. People are looking at me. They want me to do them. Well, when you shift to giving them tools and teaching them practices, then you're presenting an action step with an underlying foundation of how do I get from my current practice of where I am, of what's really happening, which we know can be all over the place, to, again, to the aspirational, where a student is rarely removed, and if they are removed, they're returned quickly. But I agree with you. There will never be an instance where no student ever has to be removed. And unfortunately, there will also never be instances where students are universally successful and always come back quickly. But all of that being said, as we build tools and practices that equip teachers and principals with better ways of responding and different ways of responding, we will reach more students. Some students you can reach with a, Dr. Martin, I want you to stop that, and I want you to stop it now. And miraculously, that tone and that direct instruction stops them. But there's other students that you have to give them some other tools. Like, is there another way that you could have asked that question? Could you have done it differently? How would that be? And then go through that. And CRIM, restorative practices, our tiered behavior response, all of those things give specific examples and tools of how to respond. And so we wanted to make sure that we highlighted not just the goals and the actions, but to highlight the how-tos. And there's how-tos both that are academic and how-to behaviorally, so that we can reach that overall learning goal for all students.
So beyond, and this is maybe the strategic plan issue, a more central staff, but I think you all can help us do this, right? How do we incentivize and reward the teachers, the APs, the principals, the counselors who are really engaging in this work? Because they're not going to get necessarily the AP bonuses that the state wants to provide. They're not necessarily going to have the highest EVOS scores, but they may be engaging in more of the hard, authentic work. So how do we create a reward structure that really incentivizes this mindset shift beyond the intrinsic, I see it happening in my classroom, right? And I don't want to discount that at all. But for a systems shift, we still reward if you're in a high wealth school where students are coming completely prepared, you're going to look like a better teacher simply because of the way things are evaluated, when realistically, I bet you could take a lot of our teachers from some of our higher need schools, plunk them into these high-end schools, and they'd actually do phenomenally. And I think you could take some of the phenomenal teachers, not to downgrade teachers, but you could take some of our great teachers from high-end schools and put them into a struggling school, and they'd struggle like crazy. So how do we address this incentive structure to try to get this work, again, off the page?
But if I could just make sure I understand your question as well. Do you think that something that's not necessarily reflected, of course, in standardized test scores, but that would be reflected in a school's panoramic survey or teacher working conditions survey, if this is implemented and these tools are processed by that school in a positive way, do you think that would be reflected in parent feedback and teacher feedback about their overall experience in those buildings, regardless of how they perform academically?
I think you'd see some of it in parent feedback, yes. But I guess, because I've talked to a number of teachers in this scenario, right? The incentive is, hey, let me teach the AP kids because I'll get the AP bonus. That's not going to come out in the teacher working condition, right? If you look at our teachers moving, right, we have a lot of teachers who try to get their foot in the door in a Wake County school wherever they can get a job, and then, hey, I want to move. We talk about facilities. I want to move to this brand new facility with, a higher wealth school. I don't have to work as hard, and I get paid more. Why don't I want to do that? So I think we're going to need to, and again, this is not maybe directed at you, but it's sort of, as I look at this, we're going to need a different incentive structure. The work is both effective, ends up, I think, being easier, but it's still hard work.
And Dr. Martin, I'm not going to sit here and presume to be able to answer the pay structure piece or incentive structure, but I think something that I might add is that I think we want all of our schools to have the educators that are as excellent as you're describing, right? And I think that's our aspiration. And even though it might be, sometimes not realistic, that's always our goal, I think, right? And I think in terms of being able to have every school have the experience that you described, I think that's what the CPED is trying to say that we're committed to, right? Regardless of the pay structure, we want to make sure that we're helping people develop and be the best versions of themselves as educators. And I think in terms of incentives, maybe one of the things we can think about as a staff is to think about how do we lift up all kinds of best practices from this lens so that it's not just about incentives, but the way in which we're celebrating, not just at the board table, but as a district, to bring out the best practices that we see. And I guarantee you that our folks from our central services leadership that work with schools would be able to tell us the best practices are here, here, and here, and they exist throughout our county and not just in one pocketed place, right? So I think it's about us trying to continue to amplify that. And then we are in this labor market where's the pipeline for the future coming? And I think us thinking about that as a district and a system will be important, so that how do we build not just future teachers, but future counselors, social workers, school psychologists, and the nursing industry is going through the same thing. Where will we find school nurses, right? So I think those are probably more at the governance and state policy level that we have to think about, that I feel sheepishly not expert enough to say.
No, and I agree. And I want to recognize that these two questions that I've asked are almost unfair questions. And yet systems change requires us asking the unfair questions, because to get it where we need to go, we have to recognize that our structure is not necessarily well set up for what we're trying to do, but we got to do it anyway. I have one question, but it looks like, Dr. Gardner, you were going to say
Thank you. I would add to this. I mean, I think there are many factors and variables that impact this. And as I'm sitting here, it reminds me of the work that we're beginning to launch in the formation of a recruitment retention core team out of our human resources offices, bringing a number of different representatives from cross departments and central services and schools to do very much of things that you're talking about, whether it's a throwback to some of the discussion we had earlier about creating teacher leader pathways within the school, incentive structures, support structures, elevating best practices. I think an opportunity here is to fold some of that work in that particular mission and scope of work that might come out of this particular core committee. We started looking at the need for this core committee just because of our staffing shortages that we were experiencing during COVID. We knew that we had to start thinking out of the box and very creatively of how we were going to recruit teachers, as well as equally important, retain teachers and the level of support. That was kind of the launch and the creative segue to that team. But I think the development of the core team and identifying the many layers of work that they can focus on, this is a great opportunity to kind of fold that type of discussion into that work. So I think there's great opportunity for some joint work with Paul's team, and I think he has some representatives on this team as already that can kind of bridge some of that work in their scope.
No, I think that is exactly where some of that, and that's why a lot of these, if we're talking systems change, it really is complex multi-component decisions. So the third thing I'll raise, and I think maybe much simpler, and that is I like a lot of what I see on the slide 11, the multi-tiered systems, where you have building staff capacity, and supports for students, and maybe I'm, again, speaking as a tired educator, I spent a lot of time working at supports for students. This semester I tried, and I've done it a couple semesters, where in one particular class where, I'm there to provide support, but I'm not going to pull you along. And I do this for advanced students, right? This is not just, you don't just throw freshmen in and say, all right, I'm there, come in when you need me, right? But one of the things that I find even graduate students often struggle with is that student agency that I think Ms. Kushner talked about. And I actually think our multi-tiered system would be good if we would have a third box. And that third box being student capacity or expectation, right? We're talking about building staff capacity. We're talking about student supports. But I think equally we need to build that student capacity, which it's a combination of building the capacity to do it and then having an expectation that you'll use that capacity. I think that triad is going to be a little bit stronger than just thinking about staff capacity and student support. So I just offer that. I think some of those pieces are already in there, but I think if we sort of call to the attention that, hey, students, you got to roll in this too. That actually calls them to a higher standard. It calls us to a higher standard, and I think just would get us to a stronger place overall. So.
Yeah, thank you for that suggestion. I think that's something we can think about and how to incorporate into the document and in our work going forward.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Martin. And then I just have just a few questions. I know we want to put a little bit of bubble between our two committee meetings here, but certainly appreciate all of this outstanding dialogue and feedback and conversation. As an overall comment I have is I do see, involving families and students, and I think that's very important as we do think about budget. It was unfortunate to see the Triple P program that's not something that's continuing for now, but parent involvement, parents as partners, offering training for parents. I know we have our Family Academy. So thankful for that work. But just curious how we see involving parents and being able to partner with them, parents and caregivers, how we can see a little bit more of that when we look at this document and really feel that we understand we're partnering with our families as well.
Yeah, Ms. Scott, thank you for that suggestion. I think it's something maybe we can try to pull out more or think about of what is the family engagement strand, particularly if it becomes a priority on behalf of the board as part of the strategic plan, that we want that more specifically outlined or coded a different color. We could think about that. And I think in terms of family involvement, from a CPED standpoint, something that we can always do maybe better is what is the process in which we might seek student and or parent feedback, right, in our work? Is it about the CPED, or is it actually in the family engagement sessions that we have? For example, like throughout the pandemic, we've been doing the family wellness circles or CRIM circles or CRIM meetings for parents virtually, but is it in those spaces where we seek some feedback about, hey, this is what we're up to as a district, or do we need to set aside time specifically about CPED? So I think those are things that we'll think about, but I think your highlighting of the need to more prominently say this is how we're engaging families is a good piece of feedback that we'll take to continually evolve this document.
I appreciate that. And speaking from just my own lens as a parent, it's always helpful for me if I hear that one of my children might be engaging in behaviors or choices that are not great. I always ask the question, what can I do to support you at home? What can we do at home to support that? And I recognize that's not always the first thing that a parent says sometimes when we do get that feedback. But it's, that's something we hope that teachers and school could have a meaningful answer to provide, but that does get very personal. That's that when we get down to the individual, and that's our challenge as a large school system, is we're so fortunate to be able to have so many resources to provide our schools with training. And then, of course, we always do recognize that it is about every child, every day. So I appreciate that. Did just want to highlight, I know that my colleagues shared this as well, but we do sometimes hear teachers sometimes feel like that culture at their school that they don't feel as supported when there might be misbehavior or choices that are not ideal with their students. So just making sure that we, again, I think that goes back to what Ms. Carter said, that we remember the why behind all of this and make sure that there's alignment there. And the last thing, which is kind of a big thing to drop, but I think it's work that we have to acknowledge that needs to be addressed collectively. We obviously hear a lot of resistance to when we see provide equity and culturally responsive training to schools and central services leadership. We see data every day that reflects the importance of this. And those of us who have been in schools, who have talked with principals, who've talked with teachers, who have lived this experience themselves, understand why that's important. But unfortunately, I think largely rooted in what I always refer to as bad faith criticism. But there is a real concern from folks who don't quite understand this language, who don't really understand what it's about, that it is not about pointing out that someone is oppressed, that we're looking at building community, that we're looking at building up our future leaders, our young students. And I think that's something I hope we can be mindful of, is how do we help folks understand this? How do we help folks understand what it really is and what it isn't and what it is and why what it is so important. So that's not something I'm expecting an answer for right now, but I just ask that we remain mindful of that when someone scans over or sees that, that in a tweet and then outrage. And, so we have to, I think, be mindful of how we can continue to communicate this and look for every opportunity to share the importance with media outlets or whatever we may be able to do.
I do want to make one comment to what you said, because I think it is of urgency in its importance. And I think that one way, and I don't know if this is particularly effective, but one conversation that I have always tried to have with people who present that kind of thinking, that this is somehow demeaning to their child or makes their child out to be a bad guy, is to kind of have a frame that we all live in a culture. We all come from a culture. And in those cultures, we have beliefs and values. All of them are important. Yours, mine, each of the students. And what that training for culturally responsive training is to make sure that all students and parents exist within their culture comfortably in the school culture. That some cultures are very much immersed in the school culture, and it's very much the same as the way that I grew up and the way my children grew up. But for some families, it's not. They either came from a different country or they came with a different perspective based on values and beliefs that might be different. And what that training tries to do is make sure that the culture that child is immersed in that classroom and that school both rewards and celebrates them and their culture, as well as introduces them to some other ideas and other ways of doing things, just like it does for every other child But I think there is urgency in your question. It's not something that we can all just kind of say, well, down the road we have to figure that out. We have to have known that yesterday, how to do that. And I think one other thing I would say is we all celebrate that we have hired for the Office of Equity. And we've had extensive meetings and conversations with Dr. Chavis. And we believe that he will bring a lens to the table that is much needed. He would have been sitting right here today, except that he was already involved in something before this meeting was scheduled. But he will be here at future meetings. And he, of course, is coming not responsible for that lens, but an equal partner who will be focusing on that and pushing all of us to make sure that we have classrooms that are responsive to the needs of all of our students. And I think that sometimes the language that we use is off-putting to our parents. And we want to make sure that we use adjoining language and that we bring everyone on board such that everyone sees we're just trying to all of us join hands and create classrooms where everyone can be successful, comfortable, and feel valued. Not one student over another, but all students, so that everyone can equally access their education and succeed.
And Ms. Scott, something I heard in your question too is just emphasizing the need to make sure to communicate with our families about what are we up to, and if anything, there might be misunderstandings, to provide opportunities to clarify those misunderstandings. And I think, to use Dr. Martin's words, I think this work, if we want to get it off the page, it has to include the lens of equity in what we do. And I think that's what we're up to here. And I think that has to be a component of this, because that's part of what prompted us to be compliant with this process initially, right? But I think moving to the aspirational, it's about trying to make sure that what we say, like our intents and our impacts, are matching up closer and closer together over time, and whether it's at the granular level or at the balcony level as a district, and those are our aspirations, right?
I appreciate that. And then I know you had a few closing.
Yeah, I don't know,
Sure.
for what it's worth, maybe I can just quickly tell you that
Sure.
the next steps for this work will be that we await any response from the Office of Civil Rights for any need on the compliance side of, do we need to continue to monitor, or what else do we need to do? We're anticipating that we have met satisfactorily the needs that they've asked, or the action steps they've asked us to take, because that's typically been the case. So this is like the overarching structure and a template of the document and the framework that we presented to you. But another next step is to begin to work with our district teams to begin updating the document so that it has more meat to the information that's there. And we're going to do that mostly through hyperlinks, so that it becomes kind of like a holder for where you can go for various information. So we'll be working on that. And then we're going to think about when is the right time for us to share this CPED with principals, to give them awareness. We're not going to say, now here's a million things to do, but more like, did you know we presented at the April 20th and May 23rd Student Achievement Committee these particular things, and this is what it means, but we just want you to be aware of it, right? So it would go something more like that than you must do this. And then we're going to bring a part 2 of this presentation at the May 23rd Student Achievement Committee, where we're going to include a data overview from the 2021 school year that is going to be a little bit more on the suspension discipline side, so because we're required to do that from a state statute standpoint. But we want to kind of couple that with an overview of the longitudinal data that we've seen, so that you see more trends up to the year prior to the pandemic, right, which is the 18-19 school year. That's our last kind of full school year where the data was not impacted by the pandemic. And then we're going to make sure we bring you some on-the-ground proactive intervention practices that both, I think Dr. Chavis from Office of Equity Affairs will be here, and we're looking to partner with a few schools to make sure that we bring their perspectives and what they're up to. So those will be our next steps.
Mr. Cohen, Ms. Chantos, thank you so much for this presentation. And as Dr. Martin said, system change is hard. And I think that when we had the abrupt stoppage, when we were first impacted with COVID, we thought, this is our opportunity but then that was not reality. But I see this happening, and this is a large school system. This is a big shift, and it can't all happen at once, but it should happen. And I hope that no matter who's sitting in these seats, that they empower the work that you're doing so that you can empower our educators to be those change makers and to provide this amazing opportunity for our students, and so that they do feel valued and they are able to succeed in those classrooms and succeed in life. So I do appreciate the presentation today, and wanted to, of course, thank Dr. McFarland, who's right over there, and for all of his work and his team today. So I know we went a little bit over. Did just want to say before we close out that we will be meeting on May 23rd, as said, to have the second part of this presentation. And again, I thank all my colleagues for your outstanding questions and feedback, and thank everyone, all of our staff, to make this meeting possible today. And we'll go ahead and adjourn at 2:53. Thanks so much.